And I think we've actually decided we are only going to do one Less Wrong post because the zombies deserve their entire separate episode, yeah?
Yeah, I think that the discussion was basically, do we want to give it like a quick rundown that doesn't do it justice, or do we want to burn way too much time for this segment on it? So we met in the middle and said, let's do an episode on it. And I think that'll bear a lot of fruit. But the Less Wrong post we are covering is Reductive Reference.
Yeah.
Reductive Reference opens we're still in the I guess what's now called the website Physicalism 201, but I'm going to say just the reductionism sequences. And he rearticulates the reductionist thesis that human minds, for reasons of efficiency, use a multi-level map in which we separately think about things like atoms and quarks, hands and fingers, or heat and kinetic energy, referring back to several of the earlier posts. Reality itself, on the other hand, is single level in the sense that it doesn't seem to contain atoms as separate, additional, causally efficacious entities over and above quarks.
Yes.
Putting it more succinctly, we use multi-level maps for convenience. Reality doesn't. It has no need to.
Yeah. He has this quote at the beginning here, which is, I guess, indicative of how things actually feel to humans. He says, I once met a fellow who thought that if you used general relativity to compute a low-velocity problem, like an artillery shell, general relativity would give you the wrong answer. Because at low velocities, artillery shells are governed by Newtonian mechanics, not general relativity. This is exactly how physics does not work. Because, at the base, there's just quantum fields interacting, and everything higher level than that is an abstraction or a simplification that we use for our purposes. And since general relativity is strictly more rigorous than Newtonian mechanics is, you could never get the wrong answer using it. You could just have to take a lot more computation to get the correct answer, which Newtonian mechanics can give you just as easily.
Unless you do the math wrong. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what makes me wonder is, and he said he met a fellow, he didn't say, a close friend and I had a long debate. Because, I mean, if it was a long discussion, it's like, all right, let's do the math really quick. And I will show you how, general relativity actually gets us closer within more decimal places.
Right.
And I remember that sentence, and he talks about, yes, like maybe it only makes a difference after decimal place 14. And that doesn't matter because an artillery shell is, a few inches in diameter or something, right? But it will never be less accurate. It's interesting. I can already just, I think, correctly predict that this guy never did the math with both approaches, or if he did it wrong once.
Yeah. I mean, right? to be less accurate, the world would have to physically run on two different systems, depending what scale you're at. And of course, it makes you right. And it would be amazing if it did. And to shoot an artillery shell at just the right speed where it met in the middle, what would that even mean, right? Oh, that'd be fantastic.
I guess that middle might only be at the 30th decimal place or something. But
you could write such a cool story, I bet, where the twist is they're using relativistic weapons and somebody switches to slower ones, which is completely unintuitive. But because Newtonian mechanisms are different, there's some kind of like edge that it ekes out and it manages to win in one special case scenario.
Well, it sounds like you should write that short story.
I don't think I have enough knowledge of physics to write it correctly.
Well, it's a good.
This is something Greg Egan would write because he, I think, is a mathematician or a physicist. Like, there's so many physics in his books. He could totally pull it off.
Who's this?
Greg Egan, the guy.
Oh yeah. I've heard the name.
Yeah.
Remind us, because I can't actually remember anything that he wrote, so I shouldn't have cut you off so quickly.
I think probably his two most famous works are Diaspora and Permutation City. Yeah, he later wrote the Clockwork Universe series. I'm not sure if it's a trilogy or a different amount of books, but in those he completely creates a new form of physics, and half of the books are just textbooks on how this physics works, which is very similar to ours, but has an additional dimension, and it's hard to read if you want fiction rather than a physics textbook.
That's awesome.
Yeah. But I know people who love it because it's a whole new physics that they get to play around with.
Yeah. No, I mean, that sounds great.
Yeah. Anyways.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this tangentially relates back to the post where he says that humans compute efficiently, thinking only of significant effects on goal-relevant quantities. No one has ever caught physics simplifying its calculations.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the important thing. And he uses the same example, which it's funny because it bored itself into my brain to the point where I thought of it, but I read it 15 years ago. And now it turns out that it just, it's stuck. But he mentions airplane wings.
Mm-hmm.
The people designing these in wind tunnels and testing them aren't modeling, or especially if you were to say build a simulation on a computer, they're not modeling the quarks, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no point in going down that small.
Mm-hmm.
It's you just kind of need molecules, or even you can model above that at just wind, right?
Yeah.
And but the thing is like that's a convenience for us. That is not how the territory works.
Yeah. Because how much computation would it take to like differentiate the quarks that are in the wing as opposed to the quarks that are in the wind going past it? Like I don't even know how one would begin to do that. We just have to think of them as separate things.
Right. Not only do we have to think of, not only do we as our, with our squishy meat brains have to think of them as separate things, but even if you're modeling them, it's not even clear what extra value you would get out of modeling or getting your model that much more close to reality. Right?
Yeah.
Like it flies just fine without us needing to be correct down to the nth decimal level. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yet the individual quarks don't know that they're in a wing or anything.
Yeah.
This brings up a kind of scary thought, I guess, which he gets into in the rest of the post. He says, our map is very much unlike the territory. Our maps are multi-level. The territory is single level. Now, since the representation is so incredibly unlike the referent, in what sense can a belief like, I am wearing socks, be called true, when in reality itself, there are only quarks? And
this does kind of relate back to what we closed or near the end of our conversation with Bentham's Bulldog, right?
Mm-hmm.
The truth can't be evaluated just by looking inside your own head.
It's
right.
Yeah, it's interesting because I read this LessWrong post like literally a couple hours after we talked to him, and he seems to disagree with that, which that's a whole thing.
And I mean, there are certainly some truths that can be found just by looking inside your own head. Logical truths, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
But not truths about reality, I would argue.
Yeah.
I think in somewhere else in one of the posts, Eliezer says you're never going to get a perfect map of California by sitting in a room with your eyes closed and the shades drawn.
Yeah. I think for him, I don't want to speculate too much, but since you need some sort of logical basis to things, I think he would argue that everything ultimately boils down to looking inside your own head to get those logical rules as a basis. But I think it is often taken way too much to the extreme by philosophers. But I do think it's taken to an extreme that makes people discount interacting, making their beliefs entangle with reality through empiricism and experimentation. And I think that's actually insanely important and is one of the core things that rationality cares about.
I agree. And I mean, it's one of those things. I mean, like, Yudkowsky puts it really well. He says, even when I have a simple hypothesis, strongly supported by all the evidence I know, sometimes I'm still surprised. So I need different names for the thingies that determine my predictions and the thingy that determines my experimental results. I call the former thingies belief and the latter thingy reality.
I love that we have such a good, simple definition of reality.
Yeah, I think it's perfect.
Yeah. Reality is the thing that determines experimental results.
I think that's a great, and it's one of those things where, everyone from the ancient Greeks onward have been asking, there's kind of like the question of like, what is reality and what is truth? What is out there? And it's like, truth is the thing, reality is the thing that, tells you whether you're right or wrong.
Yeah.
And Yudkowsky goes on to say that for every systematic way of arriving at truth, there ought to be a rational explanation for how it works.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're moving back to like kind of more concrete examples, and instead of socks, we're looking at the statement. This is like the Alfred North Whitehead, which I remember that name because I remember learning that before I read LessWrong because it was in the like old school philosophy lectures I listened to. But yeah, the classic definition of truth is what it means for what the statement means for snow is white to be true is true if and only if snow is white.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like, all right, well, what does any of that mean? I'll let you take it from there.
He says, the question on the table is what it means for snow is white to be true when in reality, there are just quarks. Out there in the world, there are water molecules whose temperature is low enough that they have arranged themselves in tiled repeating patterns. They look nothing like the tangles of neurons. In what sense, comparing one ever-fluctuating pattern of quarks to the other, is the belief snow is white true? And that seems like a very thorny question. Like, how can you even say things are true or not true when all that exists is quarks, and even our neurons are just interacting quarks, which I think maybe is why some people, through a failure of imagination, maybe just say, well, I guess that's impossible. Quarks can't do that, and therefore consciousness is a fundamental aspect of reality that is separate from physics. But I think that is very silly and giving up very easily.
And we'll have to, that'll dive us down a whole rabbit hole that we're going to spend a while on in the not too distant future.
Yes. Yeah. Elias,
but I was just going to say, I wonder, like, it can't be a coincidence that this comes after the, Human Guide to Language sequence. And one of these days, I'm going to ask Eliezer, when he was writing the sequences, did he sit down for a while first and like sketch out what order he's going to put them all in so they made the most sense? Or did he kind of just build things up and then put them in the right order as the posts kind of came up? Because, snow is a word that we have to describe that white stuff that sometimes falls from the sky, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like philosophers could quibble about, well, what exactly do you mean? Is it any of the white stuff? Is it really, does really small hail count?
Mm-hmm.
They've got snow machines that make fake snow.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean for snow to be fake if it looks just like regular snow, right?
Yeah.
So like the thing is, like, yes, all of these words have handles and associations and stuff with them, but we've now we've gone through all of that. We know how humans use words. We know what we can. Words. He's already done all the legwork for that part of all of those objections and those parts of the conversation.
Yeah, words point to clusters in thing space.
Yeah. And that means that sometimes, I'll look at stuff like a fake snow machine and be like, oh, snow. No, not quite.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really close.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm not going to confuse snow with, whatever, tables and chairs, right? Like,
right.
So I might confuse it with stuff that looks just like snow.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so anyway, actually, he goes on to say basically the same thing. I see this white stuff, and it's the same on several occasions, so I hypothesize the stable, latent cause in the environment, and I give it the name snow. Snow is then a promissory note, referring to a believed-in, simple boundary that can be drawn around the unseen causes of my experience.
Nice. Yeah, and he goes on with this promissory note idea that the entire grasp that we have upon reality is made up of promissory notes of this kind. This can be a bit unnerving, maintaining a precarious epistemic perch in both object-level beliefs and reflection, far above a huge, unknown, underlying fundamental reality and hoping one doesn't fall off. This is not the same as saying there are no hands. There are patterns that exist in reality where we see hands, and these patterns have something in common, but they are not fundamental.
Yeah, and I think that this is well, I was going to say this is worth belaboring, but fortunately he knows that and does that for us. So maybe we can just move on past it. But the takeaway here is that, like, you can have the general. I mean, is it even? I guess, yeah, it's a belief that stuff, the white stuff that falls from the sky is snow. But it's made up of previous. It's an inference based on previous observations, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that it would be impossible to come to that conclusion without ever having looked out your window and seen real snow, or even like heard of it, right?
Yeah.
I'm reminded of the story I heard of my first birthday, where apparently I had a cupcake with a candle in it, and being the little scientist that 1-year-old me was, I put my finger on the fire and burnt it.
Ooh, wow.
And because I didn't know what fire was, and that day I learned fire hot.
Yeah, right.
And maybe if I had a sufficiently sheltered existence with lots and lots of textbooks, I could have known what that looked like before I, went to go touch it for the first time as an adult or something. But this is how humans work. We see stuff out in reality. We categorize it. We label it. We assign it into various confidences, and then we move forward and update based on more and more of those experiences. I've also seen fake fire that isn't hot, right?
Yeah.
And it's just like this is just how knowledge happens, right?
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to relate this back to our previous conversation with Matthew again. Just as he says that, like snow is not fundamental to reality. Hands aren't fundamental to reality. They're both promissory notes pointing at patterns in reality, that the things that these patterns have in common. He says, elementary particle fields are the fundamental causal entities so far as we currently know. As far as I know, that is still the case. And that is the fundamental aspect building blocks of reality. Everything else is just patterns within those elementary particle fields that we can sometimes look at and say, look, these patterns exist in reality, and we are pointing at that pattern. I think I find it bizarre when people claim that a concept like goodness is a fundamental aspect of reality in the same way that elementary particle fields are, especially because goodness depends on human values specifically, which implies that humans are a fundamental aspect of existence. I don't know. It's bizarre. All I can say is that, like, I don't understand how one can get to the idea that goodness is a fundamental aspect of reality the same way elementary particle fields are without major amounts of magical thinking.
I suspect they have to say that they're a fundamental part of reality in a different way that elementary particle fields are.
Okay.
But I couldn't go further than that.
Yeah.
The other fun thing about just thinking about like the lowest level of reality is that, you know, not only has every human up through at least whatever the 40s, when did you know, quarks and stuff start being talked about by physicists?
I think earlier than that.
Maybe the 10s or 20s.
Yeah.
But in any case, like, we made it through all of human history up until about a century ago.
Mm-hmm.
You know, without having any idea, without having a closer idea of what's at the bottom of reality.
Yeah.
You know, like, we don't need this to operate or to be right about stuff.
Yeah.
You know, it, like, again, I love the hands and fingers distinction.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Yukowski, in his awesomely humorous way, paints this really well. You know, like, the higher level label of hands, you know, hands in this sort of, if you're talking about it in this particular way, are kind of an emergent thing of fingers and palms, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, so then are hands real? Well, if I really had no hands, if reality suddenly transitioned into a state where we would describe as Eliezer has no hands, reality would shortly thereafter correspond to a state where we describe as Eliezer screams as blood jets out of his wrist stumps. And this is true, even though the above paragraph hasn't specified any quark positions.
Yeah.
And this encapsulates what I was trying to say beautifully, that the every single concept and belief in your brain and mine is perched orders of magnitude above reality.
Yeah.
And it's allowed to be.
Yes.
It really couldn't be any other way. There's just not enough computing space in our brains for it, right?
Yeah. I still find it a little scary, but that's the way it is.
Yeah. I mean, like, I think that we talked about like wings and planes and stuff earlier. Like, the wings of an airplane exist explicitly in an engineer's multi-level model of an airplane.
Mm-hmm.
And the wings of an airplane exist implicitly in the quantum physics of a real airplane.
Mm-hmm.
Implicit existence is not the same as non-existence. The exact description of this implicitness is not known to us. It is not explicitly represented on our map, but it does not prevent our map from working or prevent it from being true.
Yeah.
And I think that's the important thing, is that you know, our takeaways from our multi-level maps can be, like, I don't want to get bogged down on, you know, the word true, but I'll say, like, they can be reliable enough to always give you the right answer,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Even if you're not modeling it at the level that reality models it at.
Yeah. It's a really good way of putting it.
But yeah, that's that post. I mean, the zombies post, in addition to being one of the longer ones, you know, usually these posts are somewhere between 3 and 8 minutes or whatever to read.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a mere 26, which is palatable even for me. And frankly, it's kind of riveting, but it's riveting enough that we want to give it its own shake. So
Yeah.
I think the one sentence, the 2-sentence takeaway I just want to give to the zombie stuff, you know, as long as we promised to mention it last episode. So
Okay.
Philosophical zombies, the idea that you can have an atom to atom copy of people, of say you in particular, that isn't conscious. That's the idea of a philosophical zombie.
Yeah.
This is a response to that seemingly intuitive idea that, when you give it further reflection, ceases to be intuitive, and you have to do a lot of fast footwork to accommodate.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned that because this reminded me, and I'm not trying to, again, you know, we brought Matthew on to talk with him, and I respect that he took the time to sit with us and articulate everything with us here on the show. But it made me think of, in that post, there's a couple sentences I wanted to pull out that before we cover that episode, because that'll be like a month from now. So
Mm-hmm.
he says that when a half-trained rationalists abandon their art and try to believe without evidence just this once, they often build vast edifices of justification, confusing themselves just enough to conceal the magical steps.
Yeah.
And like this was kind of the entire conversation we had. Was the next sentence in the post was, it can be quite a pain to nail down where the magic occurs. Their structure of argument tends to morph and squirm as you interrogate them. But there's always some step where a tiny probability turns into a large one, where they try to believe without evidence, where they step into the unknown thinking, no one can prove me wrong.
Yeah.
And I think we sort of approached that part of the argument near the end of the episode, where when I asked about, why would God regrow limbs or whatever, if that would risk showing its existence, and then he posited the existence of angels or some other magic beings doing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the kind of fast foot squirming stuff that he's talking about here, right?
Yeah. And the vast edifice of trying to obfuscate came down to really advanced math and really impressive math. And yet still, it's just trying to hide the basic argument.
Yeah. But it's one of those things. And just like with philosophical zombies and other kinds of fun thought experiments that we'll dive into more later, I think it can be fun to think about, but I think one should be very, very careful about trying to draw real world inference based on the outcome of a thought experiment.
Yeah. Yep.
And the zombies, it's almost its own subsequence in pure word count, but the zombies conversation is a great example of this. So we're going to give that its due time.
Yeah, either next episode or the episode after that. And in that one, we'll be talking about the zombies post, and also zombie responses and the generalized anti-zombie principle. So we'll get all three of those together in one big blog post with possibly a guest to talk about them with us.
One big episode, not blog post.
Sorry, one big episode, yes.
All right, well, that sounds good.